And the fact that it only happened to be the most consequential Sapphire in Christian Klein's ring. But other than that, nothing happened.
You're listening to It's About Data. In episode 69, Tony and I review announcements from SAP Sapphire 2026. Tony, welcome back from SAP Sapphire 2026. Also, you had a slight incident this morning, I believe, that you're recovering from.
Kind of like my little Abe Lincoln moment, chopping logs or something like that. But there was a branch that fell down in a storm yesterday, chopped it, and the damn thing ricocheted, up into my face. Thank God I was wearing glasses. But about an hour ago, this did not look very pretty.
Well, at this point, you seem mostly no worse for the wear. So that's good because you can tell us what went on. Otherwise, we'd have to wait several days.
We get patched up. The show must go on.
Exactly. Yes.
Yeah. Anyway, so just got back from Sapphire. And I would say that this is probably the most consequential Sapphire in the Christian Klein era. He's basically been, CEO since the pandemic. And that, in his words, he led his his keynote with that we're building a new SAP. Now that's a bit dramatic, but what it really signals, to the customer base is a change in which they engage with SAP as an application. Let's put it this way. I'm not talking about in terms of how they engage with a company, but there may be other things there. But it's more that in the future, and it's and this is sort of a direct, response to all those memes about the SaaS apocalypse. Which is that yes, you will be the front door to SAP is going to be through the agent front door, through an enriched Joule agent front door, not just a pure chatbot interface. And this is very consistent with what he was saying last year. All the things that they're talking about this year, you could sort of see hints of last year, which is that last year what Christian was saying was that SAP is a data apps and AI company. So it was significant in terms of data got, basically elevated on equal footing with the application. But more to the point, he said that in the future, the application itself is going to become commodity. It's what you do. It's what it's basically driven by, which is data, and what you do on top of it, which is AI. So basically saying that Joule is going to be the front door to SAP, it's a very logical, follow-on to that.
Yeah. Now I'm going to connect this with an episode that hasn't actually aired yet, but will soon. And that's one we had with Paul Blankley. I think he's the CEO of Zenlytic. And he was arguing actually that systems of record are the really critical parts that aren't commoditized. So he was actually arguing kind of the opposite, that SAP is one of these systems that you can't just commoditize. So that's an interesting perspective, but I'll be curious to see.
Well, actually, no, I totally agree with that, which is that, this whole, all this stuff, all this junk talk about the SaaS apocalypse. Well, am I good? Are you going to basically use an agent to rewrite an accounts payable application from scratch?
Exactly. Yeah. Or to constantly make changes to it. Like that's one of those, gold standard system of records that you don't touch very often.
It's more like just because you can do it, why?
Exactly.
But anyway, there were three broad, buckets or categories that I would basically group all the announcements in. It was the three. It would basically, one would be with agents, and not like SAP has been talking about agents before, but this year they really filled out a lot of at least the blueprint, and they filled out more of the scaffolding. Also, it's another broad trend, not exactly a shock, is their approach to spreading their semantic sphere of influence, and that's what everybody's trying to do. Basically view the world through their glasses, while being open to other data, but it'll be viewed through basically the way they define the world. And as I said, SAP is not unique in it, but they come from a unique position of power because of their huge base with business transaction data. I think they say like close to 80% of the world's enterprises use SAP, or 80% of the world's business transactions are on SAP systems.
And it's such a cultural shift, right? Like SAP, working with them as a consultant, it was always very hard to get data out. And so this cultural shift where they're saying, bring us your data, but also we'll share it, that has not happened in the past. So significant change.
But sharing is the important is the key term there. And the third leg of the stool this year was AI in context, the super thing. So anyway, we'll dive down and say, those are headlines. Now here are the rumors behind the news. But more specifically with agents. Now, of course, SAP has been promoting Joule
Yeah.
as the front door, and this year it got filled out. That blueprint got filled out quite a bit, because last year what we're seeing was Joule is kind of like this conversational interface, but almost
Mm-hmm.
like going into like a sort of like a Google AI search,
Okay.
or a Chat GPT type experience. This year, that experience became more contextual, at least with what they're talking about. They've added, they've upgraded the development environment, also governments, and then they've also reimagined the whole UX, both for the
Yeah.
developer and for the business user. So for both sides, both the development and the development and the consumption. So Joule Studio 2.0, and by the way, Joule Studio is, for those who've been following SAP in recent years, is essentially the agentic reincarnation of build. So it's the same sort of low
Got
code,
it.
no code idea that was
Yeah.
introduced roughly about 3 years ago.
Okay.
But essentially what they're saying is that development is going to be in the agentic sphere. We're going to be
Yeah.
putting agents together, except not radical. We saw the same thing with Google.
Right.
And we saw similar things with IBM, and they're all going to be, and we'll probably see the same thing with Snowbricks next month.
Almost certainly.
I mean, it's basically, and this is sort of again an answer to the SaaS apocalypse, which is that agents will be the front door to whatever you're going to be working with, and we need to make the development environments. We need to put them more in context. So
Yeah.
what there's basically characterizing it is that it'll be more what they call intent based. So obviously you put that it's kind of declarative as opposed to imperative programming back in the old programming terms. You say this is what you
Yeah.
want it to do, not necessarily how you want to do it. But the thing is, what they've added in here. So I mean the intent part is not so new, but it's more the context, which is that they're really bringing in now basically more of the guidance, from their knowledge graph, from the enterprise architecture, from which courtesy of LeanIX, the LeanIX acquisition, and putting that, in other words, is that when you're doing the intent, it's now being guided according to how are these processes built, and how are they been used. There's now a governance layer which they call Agent Hub, and it's really more lifecycle management, which of course puts governance kind of it's in a governance basically context.
Well, and that has to be a critical thing for SAP, right? Because as we've discussed, they're critical systems that they run, and they have to make sure that data access, for example, is governed, or they're going to have a big problem.
Exactly.
Yeah.
The processes are so intricate.
Yeah.
And I had a number of in-depth discussions with folks there in terms of the degree of granularity on how they're basically going to try and essentially control agent behavior, because of course the key challenge with agents, of course, is that they're not deterministic. So you've got to make sure to have that guardrails, or it's kind of like, I think it's kind of understating it, but it's just making sure that they are staying aligned, that they are not that they are not going to kind of go off the reservation. So
Yes.
it's pretty dense. And then on the consumption side is something called Joule Work. Now it's still start with that conversational interface, but it's going to be presented more in just not just here's a box, and go into a chat bot. It's going to become more, it's both an application paradigm and a non-application paradigm. And what I mean is it'll look to the business user with the richness of an application, but specific applications that it's tapping underneath, whether it be SAP, Concur, or Ariba, are going to be invisible. That's all under the hood.
Okay. So in some sense, that not an intentional play on words here, but they're trying to hide the family jewels. Like they're trying to hide all this stuff that they built up over decades, these key processes, but interface with agents instead.
Well, it's because it's the same thing we're saying about the modern data stack. It's that the complexity has always killed folks like us. I mean, SAP was never known for being a pleasurable user experience. Even when they had for a period during the early aughts, they had the Enjoy SAP campaign, where they thought basically kind of like a Windows rich client would kind of make SAP nicer.
Right. And it was still hard to use, right? It got the job done, but it was kind of
yeah. Another part of all this was what they called the autonomous enterprise. I think the branding is very deceptive, because autonomous sounds like we're going to have lights out and the agent's going to run everything. What it really means is it's going to be essentially super agents that are not just running inside SAP applications, but running on top of third-party applications, so that you can have an accounts payable process that that may basically include, let's say, some of your contact support systems, which are not SAP, but this agent will essentially kind of run over that. And so I see that as basically at this point more of a vision than as a delivered product. And
like a lot of things we're seeing across vendors, right? There's a lot of planning. I mean, I don't want to use the term vaporware because hopefully this will turn into something real, but it's a thing we've seen since at least the 70s or 80s where you introduce a product that's still being developed. That's what it sounds like to me.
Exactly. What this effectively does is it spreads Joules across basically the non-SAP domain. It also uses the like the A2A protocol to work with agents from those other applications.
Which that's interesting because A2A is one of those things that seemingly had faded. So it sounds like SAP is going in big on that one. Okay.
It's funny because I didn't even hear much mention of it at the Google conference. And Google was the one that basically came up with this.
Exactly. Yeah.
So that was kind of surprising.
Yeah.
Interesting anyway. But there's one interesting part, and we're going to touch on more of this later on, which is that this will be available to RISE customers, even for those of whom they're still on premises. So it's kind of cracking open the door to some of the magic that if you're still working on premises, as long as you have a commitment to RISE. We're going to talk about. We'll talk about that more at the end because I have some. Because the thing is that I don't think that SAP is really, kind of well articulated what the future is for customers that are grappling with the cloud transformation. Because on top of this cloud transformation, which has been daunting enough, we're now talking about an AI transformation.
It's a lot to throw at companies all at once. That's for sure.
And what was interesting also is that in the the customer keynote yesterday, that some of the customers are saying, look, transformation is not, transformation may be nice, maybe a nice to have, but for right now, resilience is really what's important to us.
And that's what everyone looked for with SAP. It's like, we want something that's extremely stable. Maybe it's not the most cutting edge, but it will have the features we need and we can trust it to be bulletproof. And so there's, some conflicting messaging here.
Yeah, it's not just the messaging, but it's also basically, where SAP is really pointing its strategy. And so things that, I mean, I applaud what they're doing in terms of, in terms of how they're really enriching, the Joule environment and how they're basically grounding it and the data sharing. And I think that's great, but I still think that basically there are still a lot of structural issues for their customers who are facing the need for transformation, as essentially there's a sunsetting of a major generational sunsetting that's actually going to happen with ECC.
Yeah, and sunsets are always painful, right? Yeah. Transitions are always difficult for a big enterprise.
Exactly. So another big theme was what I would call their AI foundation. I mean, it's not their term, but it's my term. But so SAP will still support bring your own model.
Okay.
So I mean, and they announced a new partnership with Anthropic, which basically is now being the rising player on the block.
Seems like it, yeah. They're always the ones in the positive news in the AI space these days.
For now, they look like the OpenAI color.
Yeah, they certainly do. I
mean, much more focused than OpenAI is.
And much better at the enterprise, which is kind of ironic given the huge head start that OpenAI had on the enterprise.
Well, the reason why is the tail wagging the dog. It's the same thing with smartphones. It was basically it was the consumer market that basically drove the enterprise market, which was a complete reversal of past trends. Like you would say, like with PCs, which really started in business and then consumers adopted it. But anyway, they did have a new version of their RPT model 1.5, and RPT is notable in that it's a language model that's strictly trained on SAP code.
Oh, okay. And they themselves are training it, or is Anthropic training this?
No, they train it. SAP has really taken ownership of that. I had some interesting discussions online, at the airport with some consultants from PwC, and I asked them what their thought, and they said, "Yeah, interesting, but our customers have more than SAP there," and and so there was a little bit of a couch to kind of response there in terms of the receptiveness to it. But I think the idea behind RPT is sound. And of course, again, SAP partnering with Anthropic is certainly a signal to say, look, we're not going to lock you in on that one.
Right. We're going to go with best in class as we see it, but we also have our own models that you can use. Yeah.
But here's the interesting piece is that right on the eve of, well, they made 3 acquisitions this year. One of them, which is basically completed, which is closed, which is Reltio, which we'll talk about.
Yeah.
But the other 2, which were announced like barely a week before Sapphire, which was basically Dremio and Prior Labs, and both are extremely strategic.
Yeah.
And SAP cannot say anything about them, but they were saying things about them.
Yeah.
They just weren't. They couldn't say this is what we plan to do, but their strategy was pretty obvious, which is that Prior Labs is a great complement to RPT. And said RPT is basically a language model trained on ABAP code, all the SAP code. Prior Labs is a tabular model. It's based on the structured data that's at the heart of SAP applications.
Yeah. And the enterprise in general, right? It's a lot of structured data in any large enterprise. Yeah.
Exactly. So that's a really interesting part of all that. It actually makes for a very logical, complement with the RPT or with whatever model you're using. Because I mean,
right.
I'm convinced that with agents, we're going to be dividing AI tasks into workflows, into multi-step workflows. That in this step I might use Claude Code or I might use Claude, but that next step I might use some other specific model.
It's funny. It's almost like unbundling and bundling at the same time. So in other words, the user just sees, like you said, it's declarative, but behind the scenes, the agents might use 50 different tools to get something done. Yeah.
Exactly. We'll move on here to context and that's sort of related to what SAP talks about with industry AI. Because I thought industry AI was going to be, we're going to develop a whole bunch of vertical versions of RPT. No, that's not the case. It's going to be very data driven.
Okay.
That was interesting. And again, that really elevates the role of data, elevates the role of basically maintaining the right context. And over the years, I mean, there were no dramatic announcements.
Yeah.
Well, outside of one, I wouldn't call it an announcement because it's more of a future development direction, but they were talking about it openly. But of course, SAP has always had its semantic tier all the way back. We just didn't call it that back to the ABAP days, in which they basically formalized. Now, originally was part of SAP Data Warehouse Cloud. That eventually, evolved a couple of years back to the Knowledge Graph, which basically added, connections, relationships to that semantic tier. And they've been bulking it up. You're still, continue to bulk up with basically with process and architectural knowledge from LeanIX. So that's adding more context to it. That LeanIX it's a very interesting. It's sort of one of these things that's in the background that's adding a lot of crucial sort of enterprise sort of organizational context and what types of systems we use. I mean, the whole enterprise architecture angle. But I think the most interesting part of all this is something which is not available right now, but what they're talking about openly, which is what they call company memory.
Yes, which we talked about before is kind of like the knowledge graph. Context graph concept that got really big this year. Really is not a brand new idea, but the idea that you have a graph that encodes kind of everything that happens inside of an organization.
Right. The lineage of those actions, which then from that you can sort of imply ontology.
Exactly. And you can get much more fine-grained if you need to understand why something happened. It's not just a description of what the current state of the business, it's a description of its history with all the interconnections, basically.
And the script and the lineage of agents.
Yeah, exactly. You start adding agentic decisions and everything gets much more complicated.
Exactly. And the thing is, SAP operate, their customers operate in some of highly regulated industries, and you have these, autonomous agents. You better be prepared to basically keep those audit trails, those trails of breadcrumbs.
Yeah.
So that's what that's all about. In terms of on the data side, what they call the business AI platform, which is kind of a superset of what we were calling business data cloud, which they still use the term business data cloud. As of right now, nothing really dramatic. Yes, there have been more. It's more integration in with the with the AI infrastructure. Optimization for context, as we're just talking about in that context here. They have added the ability to basically run HANA Cloud now inside BDC, inside Business Data Cloud, which is the same thing with what they were doing with BW Cloud. To me, the interesting part is the upcoming Dremio acquisition.
Mm-hmm. Yes, and that goes back to, Dremio is this kind of open data warehouse company. You talked about SAP Data Warehouse. this looks like a significant upgrade to that.
It is, and I think that's the way we need to view that, because actually, I don't think they were really buying Dremio for its install base. And my sense, I mean, I can't tell you that they can't really say anything in terms of what they're going to do, but I doubt that Dremio itself will survive as a brand name or as an independent data lake. It's basically kind of like what sort of Tableau has essentially become under Salesforce.
Yeah, or maybe Informatica. We don't yet know what that's going to look like, but probably that's what happens there.
Yeah. But more to the point is that SAP finally has bitten the bullet with Iceberg.
Yeah.
Which is about to bloody time. But more to the point is that how they're looking to use some of Dremio's, I think, differentiators. I mean, which is that, basically capitalize on Arrow, which is the roots of the company. And that was Arrow was about marshaling data. In other words, and from that, Dremio developed a capability which they call reflections, which is essentially materialized view but optimized using the Arrow architecture. And this is the way to essentially really accelerate federated query, and that would be the way that they would be approaching, let's say, data in other that are physically resident in other Iceberg lakehouses.
Exactly. Well, in one of their announcements, one of the big announcements at Sapphire was about zero copy bidirectional sharing of data with AWS. And I assume that has quite a bit to do with Dremio, that's still something they're working on. Exactly. So the capability is there, just has to be integrated into SAP.
So one of the things that's kind of interesting to me, because SAP customers are going to be altered in multiple clouds. We talked about this with Google when they basically announced their BigQuery cross cloud. Is that all three hyperscalers now have agreements to build basically the same type of infrastructure that originally Oracle OCI built with Azure, the direct interconnect, which is not just a piece of not just a USB core, but also a change to the business model, which means we won't charge for egress. And I've got to believe that SAP is has got a ride on that, because especially as they get into this kind of federated query with Iceberg. That I would be really shocked if SAP didn't take advantage of that.
Oh, it totally makes sense, right? It's the classic, if you can't beat them, join them. They're kind of throwing out the old cloud playbook of just trying to keep the data inside by using data egress, and realizing if you want to win, you have to interoperate.
Well, it's not just that. It's like, it's not just, it's not a concession of defeat. It's more like, my God, there's going to be a lot more money in those compute cycles.
Exactly. It's like interoperate, but try to repatriate as much as possible into
it's not repatriating. It's more it's basically, okay, you can push down the other cloud, but ultimately this is going to result in more compute cycles in our cloud.
For us.
Back at the home base, because I mean, you got to deliver the results at some point.
Exactly.
That's a really interesting thing. But anyway, this kind of relates to, I thought I want to end on kind of what I think is missing. And the big missing piece, I think, at this point is SAP having a good answer for all those on-premise clients that are struggling with cloud transformation. And that they need to have a better answer. Now they sort of have the answer, but they don't have an answer. But they don't really vocalize it, which is they will work with Dell, they will work with HPE if you're going to have your converged systems. But I think they have to take that up a step. Because I mean, I don't think we can expect on-premise customers to mount their own Kubernetes clusters and manage them. And so there needs to be like another layer of partnership there for basically for players that for partners to basically manage SAP SaaS in what's really a private cloud. I mean, what SAP calls private cloud is really a dedicated instance in a public cloud, but to me, private cloud is where it's really inside your own
exactly
your own firewall.
Well, this was a concept that several companies were pushing really hard about a decade ago. I think especially Dell had their own private cloud concept, the idea being that they manage the control plane, right? So maybe that's what it's going to be. We're using Dell machines, SAP manages the control plane, and you as the enterprise client don't necessarily have to worry about Kubernetes because they take care of it for you.
I think SAP really needs to double down on that. And it's something which I've been telling them basically when I have a chance to whisper in their ear. Because the fact is, up till now, you've had customers dealing with having to deal with basically the challenges of a transformation to the cloud. Now add to that a transformation to AI. Do you really want to basically put put both those burdens on those customers at once? Do you want to basically kind of ameliorate this? And I can see, for instance, like with agents, how they are putting in some of the pieces in place there. I still think, and they have put in a 100 million euro fund to encourage partners to develop, Joule, out. So I think, kind of, I hate to call it applications, but we'll just call it that for the sake of wording. But I think they need a similar type of investment here for cloud, for cloud transformation.
Yeah, probably. So it'll be very interesting to watch that. But yeah, SAP seems to be a company that's changing very quickly. I know they've had some cultural struggles over the years, like they bought Qualtrics, this like survey company, to try to modernize. That didn't work out. It sounds like they are changing their culture though, and really pushing forward.
No, I'm actually very impressed. I mean, I don't intend to. I'm not trying to end on a down note. I'm just saying, like, this is, I think, this is an opportunity for SAP, and I think what they're doing with Joule, I think they should also do with cloud transformation, especially for those customers that are more comfortable, at least for some of the data processes going on-prem.
Yeah, and push a hybrid cloud concept where you have a private cloud and then a boundary, and then some things can go outside of that boundary, depending on what it is. Yeah.
So other than that, nothing happened this week at Sapphire.
Okay, fantastic, except the tree branch incident, I guess.
Yes, and the fact that it only happened to be the most consequential Sapphire in Christian Klein's reign. But other than that, nothing happened.
Yeah. I mean, let's be frank. I think, sort of new age data engineering people like me like to complain about SAP, but they are a heavyweight, right? You cannot avoid them. They're just everywhere.
Yeah. They are there, and I give them a lot of credit in terms of how they're. I mean, as I said, I am impressed in terms of how they're filling out the Joule infrastructure and actually putting it more and weaving in the context layers, because SAP is so dense with context, and with agents, they really need that context.
Yeah. Well, and again, from the data engineering perspective, the data sharing stuff is very exciting, because these are problems that I've dealt with clients in the past. Okay. So my life would have been much easier with this type of data sharing.
And I'm actually looking forward to having some discussions actually with some of my good friends up there and putting them here on the show.
Fantastic. Sounds good, Tony.
Okay.
Well, thank you so much.
Okay.
Take care.
See you next week.